Hey guys, hope y'all are doing well. I am here at the school. It is quiet. It's wonderful. I've taken 3 naps since I've been here. I'm just kidding. It's been nonstop. We are going to attempt to shoot one of these videos. Make sure that you all are keeping up with your homework assignments because this is going to be connected to your quiz. Don't forget that your midterm project writing assignment, it's due by Friday at 3 o'clock, so make sure to get that turned in. Some of you all have already done that. That is fantastic. Keep up the good work. We are going to be talking about chapter 11 today. So, +1. We're going to be talking about chapter 11, Empire to Feudalism. We have been transitioning from the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire has lost itself. And so now we are trying to establish, okay, what is going to be the next power? Europe is kind of in shambles. Who's going to take over? Who's going to fill this political vacuum of power? As you guys are reading through your chapter, you're going to figure out that quickly it's going to be the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church. It's the new Christendom. So we're going to see the rise of people like Gregory the Great. Oh, let me pause here for just a second. I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm going to try to highlight just the things you need to know for your quiz. You need to read the chapter. You need to do the answers for the chapter. And obviously, there's going to be test questions later on at some point. I haven't figured out how I'm going to do a final yet, but we'll figure all that out as we go. But make sure that you are highlighting stuff. You can use your books. I encourage you to use your books for the quiz. Make notes from the video if you'd like. Obviously, you got to watch through the whole video because there's going to be a secret clue at the end that'll answer one of your questions. We're going to have a guest on to tell me when our time is up. But anyway, just stick with it. The one thing I do want to cover is I'm going to go over the feudal system with you guys, the feudal system. And I've got a little chart, and you guys are going to see my beautiful artwork, and I'll help you out with that. So anyway, to fill this power vacuum in Europe, of course, it's the church that rises up, and we're seeing that. We saw that with the decline of the emperors. Now, these popes, these leaders of the church, they're not going to be quite as powerful as the Roman emperors. In fact, they're even going to call themselves Pontifex Maximus. You guys may remember that from previous chapters, that the emperors called themselves this, and it meant high priest. And that's what the popes start calling themselves, but they never really have the same power that the Roman emperors do. They're going to gain a lot of power, and you're going to see how they do that as we go throughout the rest of this chapter. So let's start first with some of the problems of maintaining this empire. We've said this many times. It's just too difficult. There's not a central power. Rome is too expansive. Europe is too big. You get all of these problems, all of these northern issues or issues coming from the north. Specifically, we see the rise of the Franks. Now, don't get confused. The Franks doesn't mean it's a group of tribes where everybody is named Frank. As amazing as that sounds, okay? It also doesn't mean that they fought armies with hot dogs on sticks. Again, sounds amazing, but that's not what that meant. Franks is actually a word that means free. The Franks were unusual because these were people, yes, they had some powerful lords amongst them, but these were actually people who enjoyed living with their freedom. In fact, that there were times when it looked like other European tribes and issues would come in to take away that freedom from them. And that's important because moving forward, we're going to actually see the rise of freedom in Europe and see how that's spread, of course, in places like here in America. But we owe some of that to the spirit of freedom that existed in the Franks. So anyway, so that's the first name that you kind of need to highlight from this chapter is the Franks. It means free. And again, they are the ones who are going to establish the first large empire in Western Europe. Okay, they're going to be the ones that rise up. And after, of course, this is after the fall of Rome. Anyway, so this Frankish empire rises up. Now, the first name you need to know from this is a guy by the name of Clovis. And Clovis is this great Frankish military and political leader. He's a great strategist. He is ruthless. He'll basically do anything it takes to rise up. Now, there's going to be a lot of comparisons here between Clovis and Constantine. You guys may remember the Emperor Constantine was kind of the underdog when it came to rising up for potential emperors. He dedicated his life to Christ, but he did it in some ways to strengthen his possibilities to gain power. And Clovis does a similar thing here. Clovis basically says, okay, I'm going to give Christianity a chance. I think that I can gain from that politically. Clovis and 3,000 of his closest warriors had themselves baptized on Christmas Day in 498. Clovis basically uses his strategy of military and politics and religion, and he uses all of these things, kind of like Constantine, to rise up in power. Okay, so Clovis is now the great power of the Franks. Okay, now the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church recognizes that in Clovis, they got something going here. Okay, they can't really assert themselves. They don't have like the political power that like an emperor would have. And so they realize that if they can draw support from Clovis, they can use his influence to strengthen themselves. So they align themselves really early up with Clovis. Now, Clovis obviously grows in this relationship as well because he's able to establish himself. In order to be really king, you had to be recognized by God. You had to either be a god or you had to be recognized by God. So Clovis realizes that by allowing the Roman Church to bestow upon him this title, he's able to secure his position. So again, there's a lot of debate about Clovis. Is he really a Christian or not? It's very likely. I mean, look at this guy's life and look at the things that he did. He showed very little restraint when it came to punishing his enemies. So Clovis definitely used Christianity more about a political victory for him more than anything else. Now, Clovis is going to be a strong king for the Franks. Unfortunately for him and his lineage, after he dies, his descendants aren't very good rulers. Okay, the king over the Franks, it diminishes in power as time goes on. And so as you look at this kingdom, by the way, the Frankish kingdom is primarily in Germany and France. So you're going to see basically through this the establishment later on of those two kingdoms. Okay, we'll get to that later on. But anyway, so Clovis's descendants are king, but they only really retain the title of king. The real power is something called the mayor of the palace, or the mayors of the palace, and you need to know that term, okay? The most famous and most powerful of these mayors of the palace is a guy by the name of Charles Martel. Now, Martel could have been a WWE wrestler because he had one of the greatest historical nicknames in the history of time. So basically, Charles Martel would fight off the Muslims. Okay, the Muslims were attacking in places like in Spain and all of these places. And so like at the Battle of Tours, which is a really important battle, we talked about it in the previous chapter. At the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel basically pushes back the Muslims. And this is really important because if the Muslims had retained and taken over Spain, Europe could have been lost at this point. Okay, so Charles Martel pushes them back. He continues to beat back the Muslims. He continues to keep them at bay. And so through these successful military conquests, he gains that wonderful title, Charles Martel, the Hammer. Okay, it just sounds like, they need to make a movie about it. Arnold Schwarzenegger could star as the Hammer in the Battle of Tours movie. It could be fantastic. So anyway, so there's Charles Martel for you. So Charles Martel, basically as mayor of the palace, he is the real empire. Okay, he is not the empire. He is the real king. He retains the power. Now, he does not have the title king. Okay, that does not come until later. So after Charles Martel, the Hammer, dies, his son, who's called Pepin the Short, he takes over as mayor of the palace. And Pepin the Short, he decides, you know what? I'm ruling as king. We have all of the power of the king. Why should I not have the title of king? And so he says, you know what? I deserve this title. And so he reaches out to the Roman Church and he says, I want to be king. Now, again, the Roman Catholic Church understands, okay, we have got some potential here. We can align ourselves with Pepin. We can support him in this title of king, and we can gain some power in this as well. So if you read in your books, and I was going to kind of read this off because I don't want to get this wrong. Acting for the Pope, Bishop Boniface crowns Pepin king in 751. The next Pope, Stephen II, crossed and threatened excommunication, crossed the Alps into France to crown Pepin king again. So this guy's actually crowned king twice. The second time he's crowned king, the Pope declares that anybody who goes against the king will be excommunicated from the Catholic religion, so meaning throwing them out. Okay, you can't be a part of it. So basically, the Roman Catholic Church puts all of their cards on Pepin, and Pepin is now king both by title and through royal authority. All right, so Pepin is the one who creates that title. He is now made the mayor of the palace, the king. Okay. Now, following in his footsteps, Pepin is really important. The most important name from this entire probably chapter is a guy by the name of Charlemagne. Now, his real name is Charles. And Charles, or Charles the Great, when Pepin died, his son Charles takes over. Okay. And Charles becomes basically everything the kingdom wants. Okay. He is good looking. He's tall. He's strong. He's handsome. He is the Mr. Mincer when it comes to these kings in the Frankish kingdom. Okay. And so Charlemagne is now the power. By the way, Charlemagne is French for Charles the Great. Charlemagne takes over and he basically leads his country, and they have these ongoing wars, and these wars go on for 50 years. And through these conquests, he asserts himself. He asserts himself in his power. Now, he was ruthless as well. I want you to understand, all of these guys call themselves Christian kings. I'm not questioning their religion, but they do display some pretty ruthless and pretty terrible things. As an example of it, your book uses an example where after there were these 4,500 rebels that actually surrendered to Charlemagne, he still has them executed to prove a point. Okay. Now, again, take that for what you want. Now, Charlemagne as king does all of this under the name of a Christian empire. Okay. And it's easy to see why people kind of flock to this, because they saw and remembered the great times that they thought they had experienced during the empire in Rome. And so they see this potential of power under Charlemagne. And so Charlemagne rules this large area, the largest area in the West since the Roman Empire during the 300 AD. Charlemagne is called leader of the Christian people and defender of the churches of Christ. His vast kingdom is called a Christian empire. We're going to put quotations on Christian empire because just because these people called themselves Christians doesn't mean that they actually ruled in the name of Christ. All right, so Charlemagne, he is, again, he's got all this power, but what he's lacking is that title from the Pope. And so the story goes is that on Christmas Day in Rome in 800 AD, Charlemagne, the Frankish king, kneels before the church altar where Pope Leo is standing. Pope Leo III supposedly surprised Charlemagne as he's on his knees. He surprised him by placing the crown of gold upon his head. If somebody's in the building, you need to go.
Or stop by my classroom, whatever is best for you, Miss Olivia.
Sorry about the interruption, guys. This has been happening all day, but it's all good. All right. So anyway, Charlemagne, he is now got this crown of gold placed on his head. Calls him the Pope calls him Charles Augustus. Now, where does that term Augustus come from? Again, it recalls back to the time when the Roman emperors were in charge. So, in a sense, the Pope is now declaring that Charlemagne is emperor over all, just like the emperor of the Romans. Okay, the old Roman Empire of Constantine has been reborn. Okay. Long hail the return of what has been lost. And so everyone's excited. They're rejoicing. It's great. Now, Charlemagne's empire, of course, was built up by him and by the Pope together. However, it is this power struggle that is going to lead to all of the oncoming problems, is that you're now going to see, whereas both the Pope and these kings have used each other to gain power, now it's going to basically be turned into this struggle, this competition for the struggle of power. Okay, so we're going to stop there with Charlemagne, okay, because I want to move on from these rulers. I mean, Charlemagne's son, Louis, who is called Louis the Pious. He could have actually been called Louis the Weak, according to your book. There's a little bit in there about that. But again, I really want to kind of stop with Charlemagne. Now, there's lots of problems. Again, the same problems that existed before. The empire has gotten too vast to control. And as people like Louis show up, this just cannot be maintained. Okay, so there's all sorts of enemies that present issues to this new kingdom. It starts with the Magyars, who were from the east. You got the Moors coming up from North Africa. And then, of course, the most famous, the ones that I want you to know about, of course, are these Norsemen, also known as Vikings. And the Vikings were these beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German barbarians who would come in, and they would come from the north, and they would come from Scandinavia and from Sweden and Denmark and Norway, where those areas are now today. And they would come down and they would attack these villages, or they would attack monasteries, and they would basically destroy it and burn it and then take all of the stuff. Okay, that's where the Vikings came from. It's basically they were pirates of their time period. And they weren't out on the oceans or on the seas. They would attack downriver. Okay, so these Vikings were basically these pirates who sacked and looted these towns and churches and everything else. Now, many of these Vikings would actually go on to settle down in Northern Europe. And the most famous place, of course, we're talking about the Norsemen. We're going to talk about how they settled Normandy. And Normandy is the area, if you look out on a map, you'll see it's the northern coast of Western Europe. So I'm bringing that up because I like to study the Vikings. Vikings are interesting, but they were some of the most ruthless invaders of that time period. And all of this is a threat to this new empire. The new empire just cannot be maintained. And so all throughout Europe, you've got places that there's just not a lot of protection. Okay, and in the great empire of Rome, the Romans relied on the emperor and the strength of the Roman army to protect them. There's no way that this is going to be able to be maintained. There's too many threats all around this new empire. So we're going to see what happens is the rise of feudalism. Now, feudalism is kind of like the caste system. You guys may remember we studied the caste system when we studied like India, and we studied different places like that. Feudalism was basically Europe's answer for all of these internal problems. And I'll kind of explain to you how that works here in just a second, because I got a chart and you guys are going to be amazed. Like Leonardo da Vinci, eat your heart out, right? And it's probably backwards. That stinks because it's going to be hard to read. Okay, make sure that you guys at least understand what this is, okay? So this is a pyramid. It's not in your book. I don't know why it didn't include this in your book. But this is a pyramid. You can look at this online. But basically, this is the feudal system, like in a nutshell. And again, I know it's hard to kind of understand and follow because it looks like it's not on there correctly. Looks like it's on backwards. I should have written everything backwards and you could have read it. But at the top of this pyramid is the kings. Now that's easy enough to remember, right? The kings are in charge. They're the real power. But these kings would use this feudal system to gain power over their people, over their subjects, but also allowing the people, the serfs, this added level of protection. So keep in mind, a lot of this is about maintaining protection from outside forces. Okay, so you got at the top the kings, and the next level, you got the lords or the vassals to the king. Technology, right? And then the third section, you've got down here the knights, and the knights were the vassals to the lords. They served the lords. And in some cases, the lords were actually knights. And also some of the lords were bishops and priests and things like that, because the Catholic Church was also gaining land and property during this time period as well. And then at the very bottom, you got the peasants, or as we're going to call them, the serfs. Guys, this is what I want you to get. At the top of the pyramid are the kings. Second level are lords. Third level are the knights. And the bottom are the serfs. That's what I want you to get, okay? I'll explain to these how they work individually, because quite honestly, me holding this chart is not going to work for you. This beautiful piece of artwork that they're going to display up in the school to show everyone the gifts that Mr. Mincer has been given. So let's talk about this feudal system. At the very top, you've got the king. And the king owned, in theory, all of the land of his kingdom. But he would distribute some of this land to the high nobles, the dukes, the counts, the earls. And these nobles, in turn, would promise to provide a specific number of knights for the king's service. So basically, he would employ these nobles, and the nobles would be in charge of providing knights, okay, to help in times of war, battle, or things like that, okay? So it was a big benefit to the king. And knights, of course, were the heart of the military force of the various kingdoms. And we'll talk about knights in just a second, because knights are really interesting. Skipping down a little bit, you saw that these lords were the ones who were over the power of the knights. They controlled the knights. The knights served them, and basically the lords provided food and things like that for the knights. The knights, of course, fought their battles. Okay, so anyway, we'll like I said, I hate doing all this online. It's hard to explain all this online. It's easier if I had my chart, but I'm not going to pick it back up again because it's ridiculous. And then the very bottom, you have the serfs. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to all the fun stuff, and let's get to kind of the miserable part of this, because this is, of course, the medieval age. This is not a good time. This is a dark age. It's called the Dark Age for a reason. If you lived, and a majority of people did, if you lived in the area of being a serf, that means that, and that was a majority of the people, that means that you worked the manor. Okay, now the manor was the property of land that the people lived on. There's a beautiful example of this on page 118, and it shows you what a typical manor would look like. It would show you how it would be designed. Okay, and so all of these serf basically lived in these little villages, and they had very meager means of survival. And that's basically the name of the game for them, is that these serfs were basically living on the verge of death every single day. Like they didn't have much to possess. They lived in these little bitty shacks. They couldn't afford like chimneys, and so they would have a fire in the middle of the room and a hole above them in the ceiling so the smoke could go out. Like it was a pretty miserable life for the serfs, and the serfs were basically everything a slave was. The only difference was they had some meager rights. They had a little bit of rights, and of course they were the ones who provided the food and tended the farm for that of the manor. Okay, so they served under the Lord. They served everyone else. Okay, now. All of this is to say things are not really, it's not really a great lifestyle. Christendom is not really a great representation of Christ. And you see these serfs aren't really living with much. Most of the people are living under really meek, very unfree type of circumstances. Now let's get to some fun stuff, and I'll ruin a little bit of your childhood, but I'll also provide some fun stuff for you. First of all, let's ruin a little bit of your childhood. So most of what we think of when we think of these kingdoms of this time period are probably images of castles. Now let me just tell you right now, castles were not designed to be like the fairy tale castles that you probably imagine. When you turn on the movie Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, you probably see these beautiful castles, and you're seeing the stained glass windows, and you're seeing grand balls. That's not really what a castle was. Those are more like what we think of with palaces. Castles were designed for defensive purposes. Okay, so if you're into warfare, you're going to like the idea of what a castle was. A castle was like in a time of battle. If they were being attacked, all of the members of the manor, including the serfs, would come and they would gather in the castle, and they would hold up there. Okay, and a lot of the times, of course, castles, and this is where the image of moats would come. Moat was a body of water that would often circle the castle. You had a drawbridge to keep your enemies out. You had these turrets and all these things. The towers were these long towers with these little cut windows in it, and the windows were specially designed in a way that you could not shoot an arrow through it easily, but it was much easier to angle an arrow out it and shoot at your enemies. So again, it was all designed for defensive purposes. Okay, so that's really what a castle was, and they were used in times of battle and warfare. Okay, now if you wanted to aspire to be a knight, now only lords' children, only like knights of children, they were the only ones who could actually aspire to be knights. You guys ever watch the movie A Knight's Tale as an example? That would not have been possible for a serf to rise up to the level of knight. But boys in noble birth, they would aspire to become knights. They wanted to be heroes in the art of war. And so boys would begin training for knighthood around the age of 7. So let's say you were a 7-year-old boy, you could begin your training as a knight. And the first thing you would do is you would become a page. And a page was basically a household servant, and you served the Lord. Okay, and then as you rose up and you learned how to hunt and uphold the ideals of chivalry. Chivalry was this ideal of what a knight was supposed to be, a man of God, which, by the way, they didn't often represent that very well. Then by the age of 15 or 16 years old, you might become a squire. And a squire was a personal servant to his lord or to another knight in the Lord's service. So that was the next level up. So you went from page to squire, and a squire would continue the education, and more about it would be less in the servant role and more about in the art of studying for the art of war. And so he would learn to ride a horse in battle, and he would learn to use a sword, and all the things that a squire would do would be about training to become a knight. Then around the age of probably about 20, 21, they would get their chance to actually become a knight. Now you can read in your book, it was actually a long process where they had to spend a night in the church and reflect and repent, and then they would have a bath the next day to symbolize their purification and all this other stuff. But again, you went through this long process of becoming a knight because that's what little boys in noble birth would aspire to become, would become knights. And there's this long system of it. Now, there's all these other really cool imageries. You guys may have ever heard of coat of arms. Back in the time of knighthoods, you couldn't recognize a person's face. A knight had on, obviously, his armor, and you couldn't recognize his face. So what they would do is that these knights would carry around on them, they would carry these coat of arms. And a coat of arms was basically this group of emblems and figures, and it would display the knight's on the knight's armor to show his identification. Okay, so it's kind of like his dog tags, but they were really cool looking, right? And so they would wear these things to show who they were. Okay, the Mincers actually have a coat of arms. I think it has a deer on it, something sissy like that, nothing exciting. I think there's some doves. I don't know who came up with the Mincer coat of arms, but it's super lame. If I can find a copy of it, I'll show it to you. We can all laugh at it together. I don't know why we couldn't get something cool like a bear or like, I don't know, a sword or something. But anyway, that's the Minster coat of arms for you. Now, the problem is if you were a knight, you weren't always guaranteed war. Okay, you wanted to be a knight so that way you can go fight a war and have the glory of becoming this great knight. And there wasn't always wars to fight. So the knights came up with a system of tournaments and games that they would play. You guys we've talked about in Greek and in Rome, how they would have these warrior type of games to compete over who was the greatest and strongest. And that it continued through this time period as well. They would have tournaments, and in these tournaments, they would have sword fights, and they would, of course, the most famous is the joust, which a man and another man would be on their horses, and they would run towards each other and try to knock each other off with these long lances. So that was a lot of fun, try to unseat each other. Of course, these were really dangerous, but they were a lot of fun to watch. So you guys can actually attend in medieval fairs now. You can actually go and see live jousting events. It's a lot of fun. Another thing the nobles like to do is they love to hunt. They would go out on horseback and they would use crossbows. I know some of my fellow students would love that. Also really popular during this time period, I call it the original drone, is they would do something called falconry, and that's where they would train young hawks to go out and hunt small game like ducks and rabbits and other things like that, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, all that fun stuff. So all this great activities, and again, it was because they couldn't fight in a war, so they needed other ways to display their manliness, their championship mentality. All right, trying to keep this under half an hour. I know we were almost out of time. Hold on just a second. Okay, no, we're almost out of time. So just be sure if you have any questions for me, if you need to email me or call me, feel free to do so. I know. The Grinch is telling me we're out of time. We got to go. Listen, I get it. Whoa. Okay, hold on a second, buddy. We'll be there in just a second. So anyway, so if you have any questions, by the way, that was your clue for the quiz, is that the Grinch is interrupting. I know, that's great, buddy. The Grinch is interrupting to tell us that we are out of time. But feel free. I'm going to send you guys in the next few minutes. I'm going to send out your quiz as well as this video. Watch the video. Use your textbook to answer the questions. If you have anything that you need to ask me about, feel free to email me. Take your time on those quizzes. Make sure your answers are all filled out, they're complete, and that they're answered correctly. God bless you guys. Have a great day.